Okay, well, my background is initially as a fighter pilot in the U.S. Air Force. And for 11 years, I flew mainly RF-4C Phantom aircraft. And the model for Scrum, the operational model for Scrum, comes from that fighter pilot training. My last tour was at the Air Force Academy, where I was a professor of mathematics. And I was working on a doctoral degree at the nearest medical school. When I finished up my tour at the Air Force Academy, the medical school wanted to hire me to run a large grant, basically for the national funded cancer program for the state of Colorado. And so I moved my research, my PhD research, into that grant project, and I ran that for 11 years doing cancer research. My main focus was mathematically modeling the human cell on a supercomputer. So needed to understand biology, complex adaptive systems, how biological systems work, and figure out what are the steps that causes cells to change, particularly steps that lead to cancer, and can you reverse that? And if we can figure out exactly how that happens, then we could both prevent cancer and cure cancer. That was the whole goal. Now, working that out for many years enabled me to see how complex systems work. And the model for Scrum assumes that a team is a complex adaptive system. And by making small changes in the team, it moves through different states. And what the Scrum Master is trying to figure out is how to move it into a higher performing state by making small changes. And if a change is made and things don't work, being able to back out the change. So this is Scrum. It's actually based on science, research, and it's been a massive study. I published over 70 research papers in the IEEE library. Those are the only the ones that are in the IEEE library. 70 papers. So people often ask, well, did I just make this up? Was I an IT guy that made this up? No. I'm a research scientist, professor at a medical school, a fighter pilot that figured out how to get things done much more effectively. And after 11 years at the medical school, I was approached by a large bank. I may have something about this in the study, to help them with their advanced technology. And when I went, they made me an offer that my wife couldn't refuse. They offered me whatever it would take. And as soon as I got at the bank, I noticed all their projects were late. And when I looked at what they were doing, traditional project management, I was horrified because it clearly doesn't work. It's clearly an inappropriate model. Mathematically, you can prove by just running the numbers on a Gantt chart that those projects are going to be late virtually 100% of the time. And in the bank, the managers were running around and having more meetings and more reports when it was late and making it later. So I went to the CEO. I went to the CEO's office one day and I said, "Hey, Ron, have you noticed all your projects are late?" And he said, "Yes." He said, "Every day, at least 4 CIOs, we're running 150 banks. So at least 4 CIOs of 4 different banks would call him up. And he says, they scream at me every morning." And I said, well, the model that is implemented is one that doesn't work, particularly for software development. And we need to implement a different operating model. And we can't do it all at once. We need to let's take the business unit that's losing the most money. And I'll show you how to transform that And what we implemented was essentially what today is Scrum Scale. And within 6 months, that business unit that was losing the most money of any unit in the bank, within 6 months, it became the most profitable unit in the bank. And so in addition to the $15 to $20 million I had from the National Cancer Institute for research in cancer, which was basically the modeling of what became Scrum, the bank then said, here's another $20 million. You guys are making the most money. Here's another $20 million to invest in more Scrum. So by 1983, I have $45 million invested in developing Scrum. That led to a series of prototypes and testing in many different companies for the next 10 years. And particularly in what is now called GE Healthcare, my budget was about $50 million a year, and I spent $2 or $3 million just collecting data on Scrum to publish research papers. So Scrum has been a massive research project, which continues to this day. And the research is how can you take a typical team and turn them into a team that is not only having more fun, not only feeling better about their work, but getting twice as the work done in half the time, which is the title of the book that we wrote recently. So I've been doing Scrum since 1983. How many years is that? That's quite a few. And so I'm here to share a little bit about that with you.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to do a little introduction in Spanish, just for everybody to get the English of the session. And if you have questions, we go Spanish. Okay? Okay, ahora le digo castellano. Okay. Entonces, la sesión es completamente en inglés. ¿Sí? Si tienen preguntas, vamos a hacer las preguntas al final de que Jeff haga su presentación. ¿Sí? Así que prepárenlas. Para hacerlas a lo último, si alguien no la quiere hacer en inglés, me la puede hacer en castellano y yo la traduzco si mi cerebro ya lo suficiente no está rápido, si no me avisan que sigo hablando en el otro idioma, por favor. Ok, ya aprovechamos los minutos que lo dio antes para que nos contara un poco de su biografía, de su historia. Hay sillas al costado, los que se quieran sentar. Les pedimos a todos que ayuden a los que van llegando a que se puedan sentar, estamos todos cómodos. Esta charla va a estar grabada, así que espero que tengamos el consentimiento de todos para que esté grabada y después va a estar disponible. Okay? We have here Carol, who is the chief product owner of Carol, que es la chief product owner de Scrum Scale. Scrum Scale is a company that was created in 2 years ago in conjunction with Scrum Inc. and Scrum Alliance. Okay?
Hello, everyone. Okay. Thank you so much for joining today. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chef. We are all yours.
You ready for the presentation?
We are so ready. Yes, so ready.
Okay. I'm going to pull up my screen and share it. Let's see if I can make this work. And so we're going to talk about achieving business agility with Scrum at Scale. I just want to mention I was in Buenos Aires a few years ago. I was doing Scrum training. I had a lot of fun in Buenos Aires. And is there anybody in the group that was in my training courses when I was there a week? Yeah, Paula, right? So I'm glad to be talking to Buenos Aires once again. You know,
we are in Rosario now. Rosario is in a different city, but it's in Argentina. But it's not Buenos Aires. It's Rosario. different cities.
Okay.
In Argentina, we are
You know,
from all over the world, the Latin American world. Okay.
Okay, so when Scrum was formalized, our concern, I was working with many business leaders, both in hardware and software. The hardware capabilities were increasing exponentially by Moore's law. And that first image there, cramming more components onto integrated circuits, that was the first paper that Moore wrote after or just about the time that they founded Intel. And he was describing how systematically every year they could get more and more chips on more and more transistors on a chip, and it got less and less expensive. So software development was improving very little. And so the question was, how can we get exponential growth in delivery of software, just like we're getting exponential capabilities in the hardware? And that was one of the motivations for formalizing Scrum. Now, over the years, as people have implemented Scrum, people have always asked me, Jeff, you get very high performing teams. You've written a lot of papers about this, but other people are having a hard time. And particularly a venture group that I work with said, you need to write down exactly how to get the highest performing Scrum. And it turns out to do that, you need the Scrum guide plus some basic tooling from Lean, plus some patterns. There's a new patterns book, a Scrum book is a new patterns book. And that will lead you to Scrum at Scale, which is really getting multiple teams working really fast. And so for many people, it has not been simple to get high performing Scrum. Now, the reason it's becoming really important to companies today is that there is massive disruption in the industry. So, for example, Amazon is doing loans in Germany, and they can calculate the risk of a loan in a few seconds, and they can give you a loan in a few minutes. And for the big banks in Germany, it takes them 3 weeks. So some of the strategy teams on the biggest banks in Germany have said, we have to get out of that business. We can't compete. So people thought that the banks, wouldn't be disrupted like the taxi drivers with Uber, but guess what? It's the same kind of change going on, even in the banking industry, also in insurance. And in the shipping industry, I worked with Maersk, the largest shipping company in the world. And I said, who's your competition? They said, Amazon. They're buying aircraft. They're leasing all the ships between the US and China. Okay. When I work with the FedEx and the other companies that move parcels, they said, we can't ship anything in New York City anymore. Uber has taken over shipping in New York City. One of the FedEx companies lost 100% of their business in New York City to Uber. In the automobile business, electrification is having a huge impact, and autonomous vehicles will be even more impactful. Right now, Tesla is building engines. Within a year, every engine in a Tesla car will last for 1 million miles. And the rest of the car will also last 1 million miles. Why? Because they're all going to be capable of being autonomous vehicles, robo-taxis. And that is not only that's going to have a really major disruptive force in the automobile industry. It's already happening. Every manufacturer every car manufacturer in the world is losing market share to Tesla in the United States right now. In the utilities, there's a chart there on solar. The price of solar per watt was $100 back in 75. In 2015, it was 84 cents or 61 cents. Last year, it was 34 cents. This year, it's less than 34 cents per watt. The cost of implementing solar and replacing your electricity bill, the payback period is less than 4 years where I live. That means you put in solar, instead of paying your electricity bill, you pay off the solar install, and then 4 years later, you get free electricity for 20 years. So electricity is free. You don't need to be paying for it anymore. And the battery installations, I'm beginning to install batteries in my solar system, make it even more effective because my house will essentially not run on the grid. It will only ask the grid for electricity if it needs any. So the utilities are getting radically disrupted. Energy, the Tesla effect is the oil analysts predicting by 2023, the demand for oil will start going down because cars will be electrified. And that will have a major disruptive force across the world. Every industry is being eaten by software, and AI and robotics are part of the manifestation of that, and it's affecting jobs, it's affecting business, it's affecting industries, and it's affecting countries. And that means everybody has to innovate more. Everybody has to produce things faster, and they have to be less expensive. And so people come to me all the time, they say, we need to transform our company to produce products that are faster, better, and cheaper. So Forbes published some data on transformations recently, and in their data, it shows that 47% of them were failures. And the MIT Sloan Business Review, my company is right across the street from the MIT Sloan Business School, says most of those failures are terminal. That means the company goes out of business or gets sold. The tooling people are using for transformations is 77% Scrum. So Scrum is the primary tool to deal with this problem. In the bottom right, it has data on where Agile is implemented in the organization. And the green bars are lagging companies, and the gray bars are companies that are doing pretty well. And if you look at that chart closely, you see as Agile gets spread more and more across the organization, the ratio of leaders to laggers gets bigger and bigger. The more you spread Scrum across the organization, the more successful your company will be. And so that's one of the major driving forces of Scrum at scale. A lot of people think Scrum is just for IT, but that's not the way I started. I took an entire business unit, everyone, sales, marketing, support, installation, scrummed it all. And if you do that, you can have major effects on success rates. One of the things that's a big problem in the world today is everybody says they're doing Agile, or a lot of people say they're doing Agile, but they're not delivering. So here's the data on hundreds of thousands of projects during the period 2013 to 2017, split into traditional versus Agile. The good news is the Agile success rate is 42% and the traditional is 26%. The bad news is that 50% of Agile projects are late, over budget, with unhappy customers. So these people are saying they're Agile, but they're Agile in name only. And since in the United States, the law is that all Department of Defense projects be Agile, or at least all the IT projects, there's a Defense Innovation Board of industry experts that's been created to address what the government should do. And they recently wrote this document called Agile BS. And in there, they have the questions that need to be asked when someone submits a proposal to the Department of Defense to try to get a government contract. The first question they're going to ask, can teams deliver working product every sprint, including the first sprint? If the answer is yes, that contract should be considered. If the answer is no, that is Agile BS. It goes in the waste bucket because it's not Agile at all. So there are about 20 questions like that that are asked by the board to weed out the real Agile from the fake Agile. And one of my goals with all the Scrum training that we do at Scrum Inc., but also Scrum at Scale, is to actually enable companies to really deliver Agile in the way that the Defense Innovation Board points out what Agile really means, okay? We've tried to document that not only in the Scrum Guide, but we now have the Scrum at Scale Guide that shows how to do it with many teams all at once. Scrum at Scale is a component model of an organization that shows what pieces need to work to enable high performance, high value delivery. And there are two pieces. One is we call the Scrum Master cycle. This is the team cycle. And the other is the product owner cycle, the prioritization cycle. And the product owners need to have a strategic vision of where things are going. They need to be able to prioritize at the portfolio level. They need to be able to break down backlog to feed it to teams. They need to have a plan for releasing. On the team side, they need to do continuous improvement, remove impediments, coordinate across teams, deploy the product. When the product is deployed, there's feedback from the customers that needs to be integrated and update the strategic vision. In order to make that work, there needs to be a leadership team on the prioritization side and a leadership team on the execution side. And we'll talk more about that in a moment, because we found that Agile really only works when you have Agile leadership. People are often concerned about scaling the number of teams, but also teams may be in many different parts of the world. They may be distributed across the world. But even more important is how much is Scrum saturated in the organization? How much does it cross the organization into different departments? And also, how do we scale velocity? Because if you'll see it in a moment, at Toyota, we're able to do more with 20 people than we can with 200. So we don't want to scale to 200, we want to descale to 20 to get more done. And this is more important than scaling, descaling. So we need to talk about that. A few years ago, the Agile leadership at Intel came to me at a conference and they said, Jeff, at Intel, we've learned how to put 4 billion transistors on a chip. And to do that, we need what we call a scale-free architecture. And that means that every component on the chip has the same model as every other component. It's fractal in nature. And they said, in order to get Scrum to scale, you have to have a fractal implementation of Scrum. And all these scaling frameworks out there, they don't have a fractal implementation of Scrum. So from Intel's point of view, they don't scale. So they said, Jeff, you need to write down how you get the same performance with 100 or 1,000 teams as you get with one high-performing team. Because that's a hard problem. When you have 1,000 teams, how do you get 1,000 times the output of one team? And it only can be solved by having a scale-free architecture for the framework itself. Here's an example of one of our Scrum at Scale case studies that's on the web. That shows you the kind of structure you see when Scrum at Scale is implemented. And each pentagon is a team, and the red is the Scrum Master, the yellow is the product owner, and we get sets of teams collaborating in a scrum of scrums. And at the top of the organization, we have what we call an executive action team, which is really the enterprise scrum of scrums, and an executive meta scrum meeting where the chief product owner team for the enterprise meets with the stakeholders and gets alignment with the organization on the backlog. And the structure of every company will look a little different. This is just one example. A key aspect of trying to make an organization really effective is how long does it take to make a decision? So Jim Johnson recently took the data, the Standish Group data, and looked at what makes the most difference between success and failure. And he found it was decision time. If the decision time is on the average is less than an hour in a company, the success rate of projects is 58%. If it averages more than 5 hours, that drops to less than 20%. This difference is bigger than the difference between Agile and Waterfall. So he says, the reason Scrum works is when it lowers the decision time. So in order to get Scrum to do that, you have to implement it properly and push as many decisions as possible down to the team, make the teams as autonomous as possible, have the product owners working closely with the team so any priority conflicts can be resolved within an hour, and having a leadership team meeting every day so for larger problems, they can solve them within a few hours. And only then do you get a 58% success rate for your projects. So step one is to set up teams that are implemented in accordance with the Scrum Guide. The Scrum Guide is highly optimized to enable high performance. There's nothing in it that's not needed for high performance. And we've been working with Ivar Jakobsen's company, Essence, which has developed an international standard for modeling methodologies. And we worked together with them and created the model for Scrum that implements the Scrum Guide. That model takes the form of 24 cards. And at the core of them, the core of the implementation are the idea of self-organization, the Scrum pillars, which are transparency, inspection, and adaptation, the Scrum values. If you don't have a really open environment where people respect people and have the courage to speak up, you can't get the focus and the commitment. So those values are really core. And that is the basis of starting to implement Scrum. And when we do it, start implementing the Scrum teams with the Scrum Masters, if we're going to scale that up, we need to scale the product owners and the Scrum Masters. So we want to take a set of teams, we call it Scrum of Scrums. We want to have members of those teams meeting every day in a scaled daily Scrum. And at the top of the organization, we want to have an enterprise Scrum Master. So with a Scrum team that is responsible for removing impediments at the organizational level. We call this an executive action team. It's an enterprise Scrum of Scrums. If we do this and we have no other management, no other project.
Oops. Nope. Lost you, Jeff.
Needed. You lost us?
Yeah, we lost you for a minute where you said if you have no other.
Okay, so in order to scale and get increasing performance as you add teams, you need a minimum viable bureaucracy. And in Scrum at Scale, we implement a Scrum of Scrums, a team of teams, that is a higher level Scrum, and an executive action team, which is really an enterprise Scrum of Scrums. And those teams are the operational aspect of Scrum at Scale. On the product owner side, on the prioritization side, for a set of teams, we need a chief product owner that works with the team level product owners to make sure every team has a backlog that flows from the one chief product owner backlog. And at the top of the organization, we need a chief product owner team that is meeting regularly with stakeholders, getting the entire organization aligned with the backlog. We call that an executive meta Scrum. So this combination of Scrum and Scrums, the executive action team, which is the enterprise Scrum of Scrums, and the product owner teams at the top level, the chief product owner team that meets an executive meta Scrum. This is the structure that you need, and any more than that will slow you down. So that's what we're trying to communicate with Scrum Scale. What is the simple, essential structure you need to get high-performing teams? So they perform 100 teams. Every one of those 100 teams can perform as well as one high-performing team. Or same thing if you have 1,000 teams. Now, here's one of the ways we think about that. In the United States, it was a baseball team. Do you play baseball in Argentina? Well, the Oakland team was losing most of their games. So they hired a statistician to look at the baseball data. And the statistician told them most of the runs are made by people that can just get to first base. The people that can hit home runs get some of the runs, but not most of the runs, and they're very expensive. So don't hire any of them. Only hire people that can get to first base. So they did that, and this was the data after 1 year. They were number 2 in the league in wins, and their average salary was much less than average. So how can we implement that kind of idea in our Scrum? Well, here's a picture of a typical company. We go in. What we want to do is at the enterprise level, we need a chief product owner for the organization. We want them meeting in an enterprise meta Scrum, which has the stakeholders there, and we want everything prioritized, all the projects, all the products, all the initiatives. And every time we do that, we see about 30% of the bottom priorities are things that do not add any value. And once the management clearly sees that, they stop those projects. They add no value. Sometimes the teams are not getting any direction, they're just making up work. When the business looks at that, they say, hey, we can't sell that stuff. So the first thing that you want to do with Scrum at Scale is eliminate, I'm calling it dark work here. the projects that have no value. Then the second thing we know from many years of research in software, we see the same in hardware. 2/3 of what is built is never or rarely used by the customer. And the venture group I work with, we call those junk stories. The customers might say they need them, but when you deliver them, they don't use them. So we need product owner teams working to eliminate those stories that customers won't use. At the top, 25% of the work the customer actually will use, and we want to deliver those as efficiently and effectively as possible. And we want the Scrum Masters really improving the process efficiency of delivering. Process efficiency is a lean metric. It's the actual work time divided by the calendar time. So the only company I found that knows the process efficiency of their Scrum teams is General Electric, because they have Lean Six Sigma experts that measure it. But the data is all in Jira. You use Jira down in Argentina? Probably some of you do. But the data is in any good Scrum tool, because you know when a team picks up a story, you know when it moves to done, and you have an estimate in the beginning of how much it would take. So if a story, if the process efficiency is 20%, that means that for something that would take a half a day of work, that takes all 10 days of a 2-week sprint to get to done. So half a day divided by 10 days is 5%. Now, I coached an Indian team recently on this, and I told them, you know, the data's in your Scrum tool. Make it appear as soon as you open the tool, and make that number go up. And in 3 days, they moved it from less than 10% to 80%. And on the 4th day, they were done with everything in a 2-week sprint. So you could go out of this meeting next week and get everything done in a 2-week sprint by Thursday morning. If you did what these guys in India did, just made it process efficiency visible and made it go up. It is really unbelievably simple to go really fast. Let's see, I'm having trouble with my screen here. I'm having a sharing a problem with Zoom.
Okay. Don't worry, we all struggle with Zoom, so.
What I will try to do here, if I can, pause the share, stop the share. I'm going to stop the share and then reshare, okay? See if that works.
You stop it and now.
There we go.
Okay, yes.
So there's the data on, if process efficiency is 5%, as it was at GE, and only 25% of the stories are useful, 5% times 25% is 1.25%. If we can increase that to 5%, we've done twice the work in half the time. And I've already pointed out that an Indian team figured out how to do that in 3 days. So there are many large organizations doing Scrum with many teams today. And one of the biggest problems is that the waterfall management wants the organization to get agile, and they still want all their waterfall reports. And so what they do is they create a translation layer between the waterfall and the agile. And the problem with that is that it cripples performance. And Professor Carter at Harvard has pointed out that in the long run, that Agile implementation will fail. He's never seen a successful Agile implementation sustainable over the long term with waterfall leadership. So to make it work, the leadership needs to become Agile. They need to support the product owners at the top of the organization. There needs to be a leadership team that is a chief product owner team, aligning the whole organization behind the product owner's backlog. There needs to be a leadership team at the executive level as in an enterprise scrum of scrums that is supporting the Scrum Master organization and helping them remove impediments to go faster. And we see that in many companies, Microsoft, Salesforce, SAP, for example, that have had Agile implementations that have been running for decades. And they're winning in their market. Microsoft became this past year the most valuable company in the world, beating out Apple and all the oil companies. Microsoft is a Scrum company, and they've learned how to do it at scale. Now, it's interesting when you look at how companies evolve. I'm going to show you a Toyota case study. Toyota is a very hierarchical, traditional company, but they're very good at creating cross-functional teams that do iterative delivery to build new cars. But they haven't changed their management hierarchy. When you move to a company like Amazon, Amazon today has 3,300 two-pizza scrum teams. That means that they can be fed, the team can be fed with 2 pizzas at night. So 6 to 8 people. And they deliver a new feature to the market more than once every second. So that whole Scrum is on a 3,300 autonomous teams being driven by product owners. And in some organizations, a good example is Hire in China. They are building what they think is the internet organization of the future. They took their 4,000 managers and they said, okay, we're going to make every manager the CEO of business unit. And we're going to give every manager 10 or 15 people. And those business units will all be independent and autonomous. And the CEO set up a product owner platform group. And for the products that Hire builds, they need multiple business units to collaborate. So the platform group's job is to convince business units to collaborate either inside the company or third parties outside the company to produce new products. But they have no authority to direct the business units to do anything. So there's a CEO, there's product owners with no authority to do anything. And then there's autonomous independent business units of 10 to 15 people each. And so this is a multi-billion-dollar company that's tremendously successful. And this kind of organization is becoming more and more the model that future companies are heading in order to be faster, better, cheaper, and in order to scale. Let me give you an example of a Toyota project that we did. We had a team at Toyota last year, all year. And the first thing we did was prioritize our enterprise backlog. They had 324 projects, initiatives, new products in the backlog for Toyota America. And we said, okay, the bottom 30%, we don't want to do those. Let's focus on the top items in the enterprise backlog. And the first top item we went to work on was the system that paid dealers for selling Toyota cars. Pretty important system. they had 200 people working on it for 5 years, and nothing had been delivered. We looked at who do we really need to actually deliver this. We got about 30 people with a strong product owner, broke it down into multiple Scrum teams, and delivered to the dealers in 6 months. So if you think about that, the difference in performance of 30 people delivering in 6 months to compared to 200 people delivering nothing in 5 years, that's a pretty big difference in performance. A lot more than twice the work in half the time. Okay, so on big projects and big companies, particularly government projects, the cost savings, the speed is unbelievably faster. And we have many examples of that. Some of them are in the book on Scrum. Here's the first Scrum Scale prototype. I mentioned this when I started talking. I was pulled into the banking company running 150 banks. And it was clear that not only does waterfall not scale, it can't even deliver any project on time. And so my recommendation was to the CEO was to create an entrepreneurial unit within the larger company with a different operating system. And we selected the unit that was rolling automated teller systems, cash machines out to 150 banks all across North America. We took everybody in that division that touched that system, sales, marketing, support, installation, software developers, put them in teams of 4 or 5 people. And we had the product management come in Monday morning, build a backlog of the highest priority things to be done that week. And on Friday afternoon, I said, we're going to be done. And that means it's deployed. And I said, I'm going to show you how to land a project on Friday afternoon, just like I taught fighter pilots to land the F4 I flew. That picture is the flight of the last F4. And in pilots, they're trying to maintain the glide path. So I said to the teams, we're going to give you a burn down chart so you can see where you are in the glide path. And I said, I know the first few times you're going to be just like a new pilot. They come in high, they have to go around, try it again. We're going to do that over and over and over until we can land that project right at the end of the runway. And within 6 weeks, the teams were able to do that. When we started, costs were 30% higher than revenue. 6 months later, revenue was 30% higher than cost, 60% swing in margins within 6 months. That was the first implementation of Scrum at Scale. So Scrum at Scale is directed at organizational performance. How do we take team performance and turn it into organizational performance? I was reading on LinkedIn this morning, they were saying most agile teams are not delivering any change in performance at the organizational level. So there's something missing. And in Scrum at Scale, we're trying to implement that missing link. And if we do that, we get things like, here's Pegasystems, a publicly traded company. Back in 2009, we implemented Scrum company-wide. And as we were implementing it, the stock price went up 400%. And then they got distracted. Once their stock price was so high, they started buying companies, and they were totally involved in just integrating other companies. And so they got lazy for a few years. I kept on telling them, you're not done yet. So in 2016, they brought me back in there to work with the product owners. And you can see after I did that, the stock price went up 4 times again. So a good implementation of Scrum at Scale will drive not only higher quality product, but higher market share, and that will lead to higher company valuation. And if it's publicly traded, higher stock price. And we have a number of case studies showing that. In fact, the venture company I work with, in 2006, we began implementing, we didn't call it Scrum at Scale then, but the Scrum at Scale model, and not only for all our investments, but for the venture company itself. And our goal was to double the return on investments using Scrum. We have close to $1 billion invested in teams. One of the companies, we typically invest about $10 million. One of the companies we sold to Salesforce a while back for $2.7 billion. Last year, fund number 4, we have multiple funds. Each fund is about $200 million. So fund 4 came into 2018 with $200 million invested. At the end of 2018, it's worth almost $500 million. Now, the average VC company gets about a 15% annual return on investments. This is 100% with Scrum at Scale. This was the goal of the venture firm. So I strongly recommend you take a look at some of the Scrum at Scale case studies. Paula is a certified Scrum at Scale trainer, and she has a case study that's on the web. I put the YouTube link there so you can go take a look at it. But we have case studies from Toyota, many other organizations. Some of you may not realize that the Spotify model is a Scrum at Scale case study. That might be a very interesting one for you to take a look at. And we do Scrum at Scale training regularly. It's a 2-day course where we build a map of how well is an organization doing. So this map has organizations across the top, and then for each organization, how well are they doing with the components of Scrum at Scale? And we do an analysis of how to tune up the organization to make it perform better. The next one in Buenos Aires is November 28, 29. For those of you who may be experienced Agilists, we do regular train the trainer programs to create certified Scrum at Scale trainers. And the next one is in Amsterdam in 2 weeks. There's still a couple of slots. So those are the comments I wanted to make for today. And I think I'm within my time box.
You are. We have 10 minutes.
Thank you a lot. We have time. Do you have time for 1 or 2 questions?
Yeah.
Okay, no tenemos mucho tiempo porque seguramente van a tener que ir a otras, pero si alguien tiene 1 o 2 preguntas, es lo único que podemos hacer. Sí, rápido, ¿quieres acercarte? No, tenés que acercarte porque el cable no llega. Y pararte acá, así te ves. ¿En inglés? Dale.
Morning. Do you have any tips, recommendation for escalate the Agile framework to other departments like sales, support?
Okay, Paula, can you repeat the question for me? Tips on?
How to implement Scrum and Scrum Scale non-IT teams.
Okay, so Scrum at Scale non-IT. Scrum at Scale is specifically designed for non-IT teams.
Yes.
So we're working with research teams. We're working with biotech teams. We're working with hospitals. We're working with schools. We're working with almost any team. So the major difference in non-software teams, like if you have a Scrum and a sales team, they have a different kind of backlog than a software team. Their backlog is all the customers and prospects that they have and where are they in the sales cycle. And what they want to do is move the customers and prospects at the top of their backlog to close as fast as possible, right? And so in order to do that, there's certain actions that they must take. Those turn into the stories inside a sprint. Other than the backlog management, everything in a non-IT Scrum is virtually identical to a software Scrum. And what I've noticed is that the software engineers tend to make it more complicated, but it doesn't need to be.
I think we are here. ¿Alguna pregunta más? ¿Una más?
Yes.
Última.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeff. One question. For the success of this scale, what is the thing that is most important as an ingredient for the scale? The culture, the tools, the technology, the sponsorship. What is the best ingredient to the success, to the Scrum scale?
Okay, so tools don't make you successful, so we can set those aside. The culture is usually a problem. So in Scrum at Scale, what we want to do is typically the organization needs to be more agile, particularly for new product development. So what we want to do is take a small piece of the organization and implement Scrum and have a leadership team that we call it an enterprise action team that runs as a Scrum that is the management for that agile piece of the organization. And they protect the organization from the waterfall culture, and you bring into the agile piece, you bring people that want to do agile. And in that agile bubble, you resolve all the organizational impediments that would slow them down. And when you have that working really well, we call that a reference model. Once you have that reference model working, then we can replicate that. We can cookie cutter that all across the organization. But until you have that reference model working, many companies try to boot up 300 teams at once and they get them all running Scrum and none of them are working very well. They all suck. In fact, this is the worst possible scenario for me because I come in and they're, oh, we're already doing Scrum. We know everything. We don't need to change. And even though we suck, we're not going to listen to you. That is really the worst case. So we strongly recommend people start small and use Scrum at Scale to build a working model that can be replicated across the organization.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much.